Welcome back. The next item of business is topical questions. The first question, number 1, Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with the offshore industry regarding the impact on the oil and gas industry in Scotland of the recent Super Puma tragedy.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I would like first of all to express on behalf of the Scottish Government, and I know all of Parliament, our condolences to the families of the 4 people who lost their lives when the Super Puma helicopter crash took place on the 23rd of August, and also express our sympathy to the individuals who also were on board the flight at the ordeal that they endured in these circumstances. Since the crash, the Scottish Government has worked closely with the United Kingdom Government, the offshore industry and other key stakeholders in managing the consequences of this incident regarding the impact on the oil and gas industry in Scotland. Officials have been fully engaged in the Helicopter Safety Steering Group meetings held on Saturday, Wednesday and Thursday following the incident. Officials have also participated in the oil and gas leaders' meetings at which all operators in the North Sea were present. I spoke with Malcolm Webb, the Chief Executive of Oil and Gas UK, the representative body for the UK offshore oil and gas industry, and I have also had discussions in relation to the incidents with both Jake Malloy of RMT and both John Taylor and Pat Rafferty of Unite. On Friday, I visited the Police Gold Command in Aberdeen to speak with the emergency services, who deserve our grateful thanks and acknowledgement for the excellent rescue operation which resulted in the saving of 14 lives. Subject to the agreement of Parliament, I will make a full statement on this issue tomorrow.
Mark MacDonald.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, and I would echo his expressions of condolence. Those of us who have family, friends, constituents working in the offshore sector will know how difficult this period has been for many individuals across Scotland. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise in what ways the Scottish Government is able to and stands ready to support an industry review of helicopter safety?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can confirm to Parliament that the Government will cooperate in all ways that we can with the industry in relation to the review of safety and the encouragement of safe utilisation of modes of transport in transporting individuals to the North Sea oil and gas sector. As I indicated in my response, the Government's officials were participants in the Helicopter Safety Steering Group meetings during the course of the last week. I think these proceedings were, in my opinion, a model of how this dialogue should be conducted in partnership between employers and the trade unions involved, with a willingness to consider and to address the very serious issues and concerns that would be relevant to members of the oil and gas staff who would be concerned at the circumstances that they face. So the Government will certainly actively work to facilitate and encourage that review of safety.
Mark MacDonald.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. He will also be aware that, as we have discussed, that there are concerns among workers, and not just workers but their families as well, around the continuing safety of helicopter flights to offshore installations. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that it would be his view that there needs to be a very careful dialogue between operators, the unions, the workforce and the wider oil and gas family, consisting of family members, etc., in order to restore some of the confidence that has been damaged by the recent incident and also incidents over the last 5 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think that dialogue is absolutely crucial. It is vital that the industry engages in dialogue, as took place at the Helicopter Safety Steering Group, between employers and trade unions as representatives of the workforce. I certainly saw, in observing very closely the proceedings of the Helicopter Safety Steering Group over that period, the way in which information and advice was marshalled to the employer and trade union representatives, which enabled a considered judgment to be arrived at to enable the temporary suspension of the utilisation of some of the Super Puma fleet to be overcome. And that was achieved because of evidence-based discussion involving all parties. And I think that represents the way in which we can try to address the legitimate anxiety that members of the public will have about ensuring that in all circumstances individuals are able to be transported to the oil and gas sector safely and reliably, and that must be an objective for us all.
Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will know the difference that was made by the Cullen inquiry established following the Piper Alpha disaster to offshore health and safety on rigs and platforms in the North Sea. Given the high number of serious helicopter incidents in the UK sector of the North Sea compared with other parts of the same province, will he support calls for a public inquiry into helicopter transport in the UK sector, which would go beyond an internal industry review, but would follow the model set by Cullen in order to give the same confidence to the workforce in helicopter transport in the North Sea as they could have following Cullen in safety on rigs and platforms?
Cabinet Secretary.
My response to that point, and I obviously am familiar with the issues that have been raised in this respect in connection with helicopter safety, is to say that I think the most effective thing we can do is wait until we have the full outcome of the inquiry in relation to this particular circumstance as to whether or not there is merit in taking forward that wider inquiry. And I say that because if we look at the incidence of the experience of helicopter safety, there has been over the last couple of years, and I think this is the point of very great regret about the incident that took place on the 23rd of August, there has been a rising tide of confidence in helicopter safety in the North Sea. That has clearly been undermined by the incident on the 23rd of August. And I think before we form a judgment on whether a full inquiry is required into these matters, we should allow the investigation of this particular incident to take its course and to hear the outcome of the work that has been undertaken by the Air Accident Investigation Branch, which of course lies at the heart of the investigative role in this issue. And of course the points that Mr MacDonald raises can quite properly be considered in that context.
Question number 2, Jackie Baillie.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to support food banks.
Minister Margaret Burgess.
Thank you. Before I start, I would congratulate Jackie Baillie in her new role as shadowing the welfare portfolio, and look forward to some lively spats, as my health colleagues have in the past. The Scottish Government supports access to affordable, healthy and sustainable food for all, and acknowledges that with the current economic climate, welfare reform and increasing food prices, this is becoming a greater concern for many people. This Government has provided an additional £9.2 million to the Scottish Welfare Fund, which means we are providing the capacity to award an additional 5,600 community care grants and more than 100,000 crisis grants in this financial year. This fund will provide people with emergency support so that the necessity for food banks should be reduced. However, my concern is that the UK Government's benefits reform programme unfairly impacts on some of the most vulnerable members of our society. And in particular, I am concerned that these cuts and changes to the welfare system will undermine the long-term approach that we are taking to tackle the causes of poverty. The solution is for the Scottish Parliament to have control over welfare matters so that we can devise policies for the benefit of the Scottish people.
Jackie Baillie.
Thank you very much. Can I thank the Minister for her welcome to my new portfolio? I hope she doesn't regret that welcome in a few weeks' time. But can I say to her, I'm most interested in the powers that you already have as a Scottish Government, powers that you should be exercising to protect the most vulnerable. Because frankly, Presiding Officer, I'm appalled that in 21st century Scotland we have food banks in our communities. And according to the Trussell Trust, the number of Scots accessing emergency food banks over the past year has increased by 150% to over 14,000 people. Almost one-third were children, and that should concern us all. So what more can the Scottish Government do to specifically help children experiencing such extremes of poverty that they have to depend on food banks?
Minister.
The Scottish Government has taken forward a number of actions to reduce child poverty in Scotland, which is a concern very much for me and for the Scottish Government. And I think, and I said earlier, the way we have put in a number of activities to support this, the Scottish Welfare Fund, our social wage, which helps families that are struggling, and the social wage is helping them, the free prescriptions is helping. However, we are against the UK Government's welfare cuts, as Jackie Baillie well knows. As I laid out earlier, to have our own welfare system and in charge of our own economy, to ensure that our policies are integrated, our policies in health, our policies in housing and our policies in welfare are integrated to ensure that we can deliver the best possible opportunity for all the people of Scotland and particularly our children.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I say to the Minister there's no disagreement on this side of the chamber about the impact of the UK Government's welfare cuts, and despite the action that the Minister has outlined, we are still seeing children queuing at food banks for assistance. The Minister will of course be aware that since the Scottish Welfare Fund was introduced to provide crisis grants, there has been a significant underspend in that budget. Now that goes against everything we know about the level of need that exists in our communities. There is even anecdotal evidence that people are being referred to food banks having been refused crisis loans. So what action will the Scottish Government take to ensure that the people who need it most can actually access crisis grants rather than having an underspend in the budget?
Minister.
Rather than criticising the Scottish Government in terms of the Scottish Welfare Fund, I think Jackie Baillie should be congratulating us on establishing that fund and topping it up by £9.2 million. This is a new fund which came in April this year. It's not bedded in yet. We are doing everything we can to encourage people to use the fund. I have spent the summer recess travelling up and down Scotland, speaking to local authorities, to third sector organisations, to community groups, to promote the fund, to encourage take-up of the fund. We have set up an officer within the Scottish Government who's monitoring the fund to look at consistencies and to look at how we can do it better. So I would say to Jackie Baillie, she should join us in doing that and congratulate the fact that we have this fund to protect our poorest people rather than criticise us.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday I met with the food bank in Inverclyde who informed me that since they opened up last September, they have fed 2,500 people, of which 750 have been children. And these figures are worsening, and yet the full effects of welfare reform have not yet been fully felt. Can the Minister inform me of what discussions are taking place with the UK Government to inform them that their wider economic agenda isn't working, and as a consequence there are many people and families whose lives are being devastated as a consequence?
Minister.
Thank you. There's regular correspondence with the UK Government on these issues, and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth wrote to the Chancellor in March ahead of the UK budget statement to set out the Scottish Government's concerns about the failure of the UK Government to grow the economy. And I share the Finance Secretary's particular concern about the cuts to benefit incomes for families across the country at a time when many are having to deal with sharp rises in the cost of living. And I will continue to raise these issues with UK Government ministers at every opportunity, both in person and in writing. But as I said earlier, the solution is for Scotland to have control of its own economy and its own welfare system, and then we might see the reduction in food banks in this country.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would the Minister agree with me that unaffordable water charges acting as a barrier to the setting up of a food bank in Coatbridge is unacceptable, and is charitable exemption under the Government's scheme an option to allow this desperately needed facility to open?
Minister.
Okay, as set out at the moment, the charging statement for water for 2010 to 15 exemption is only available to organisations that received exemption in 1999. So at the moment, it wouldn't be available to new organisations. However, Scottish Water recognises the issues that this creates, and they're working with the Scottish Government to look at introducing a revised scheme from 2015 that would be open to all small charities, and I accept the point that Elaine Smith has made. Thank you.
My apologies to Mark MacDonald, who wanted to ask a supplementary, but we do need to move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by Alex Salmon on the Scottish Government's programme for government 2013.